Thank you to all my supporters. Link to join is down in the description. Hey guys, today we're going to do another green screen tutorial, but this time I'm going to walk you all the way through my process and everything and have a pretty cool result at the end, so let's go ahead and get started. Now if you want to work along with us, all the download links to all the footage and stuff that I use is in the description. So first of all, let's just go up and motion track our footage, so VFX motion tracking. Then we're going to open up our footage. Okay, so here is our footage. We can just open that up. And the colors are off, so we need to change the color management to standard instead of filmic. Now we just need to set the scene frames and prefetch the footage. Okay, so now we can go ahead and mess around with some of the tracking settings. Now for the motion model, we're going to change that to location and scale, just since these actual dots are going to be scaling and everything, so we want both of those. Then match to previous frame and then normalize on. Next we can go ahead and make sure that tracking settings extra is set to a correlation of a 0.9, just so Blender is 90% sure that the track is correct. Okay, so now let's scrub through our footage just to see what we're working with. We can basically see that we have a shot where it basically backs off from our character, and there's going to be some mountains and stuff in the background. That's basically what we're going to do today. So we do have these tracking markers in our scene, so let's just go ahead and hold control and click, and then we can press Alt S to reveal the search area. So that's actually a little too small for me, so I'm going to come over here, set my pattern size up and also my search size. Then control click, and that's a little better. I'm going to increase my search size just a little bit more, just so we have more area to work with. Okay, so those are both looking pretty good for me. I'm just going to go ahead and delete those. Let's come over to this track section over here. Now if we go ahead and place down another track, we should notice that we can see this little menu over here and you can move it around and stuff. However, you will see this RGB right here, and you can actually play around with these to see what channels it actually tracks on. By default it tracks in all the color channels, RG and B. But for this, since we have a blue marker, it's actually better to track in only the blue color channel. So if I go ahead and turn the red and the green off, we can see that we are only tracking in the blue channel, and that's a lot more noticeable compared to all of the channels combined. It's just an easier way to track. Okay, so now that we know that, we can actually go ahead and delete this marker. And over here you can see this RGB again, so we're just gonna again set it to just be our blue channel. Okay, so now what we're gonna do is we're actually gonna track backwards because our clip actually reveals more markers as it goes, so it's just smarter to track in reverse instead of moving forward. So we're gonna come to the very last frame of our clip, so that's 180. I actually need to change the in keyframe down here. And also before we do need to change the frame rate of our footage, so instead of 23.98, that's what we shot. Okay, so now what we need to do is just come down here, and we basically just need to place markers on all the blue markers in our scene. So just hold control and click those, and you want to click all the markers on our screen. So I'm just going to continue to do that, and I'll come back when I have all the markers selected. Okay, so those are all of the markers in our scene. So now let's hit A to select all the markers, and then we can actually come down here, hit this little button, and that will actually start tracking in reverse. Okay, so we made it to the start of the clip. You can see that a lot of markers were lost, however. So let's just go ahead and bring those markers back in and track forward this time. So I'm just going to hit Alt E to hide all of the untracked markers, and then at the very first frame we're just going to do the same exact thing. Just select all the markers that we can see that don't have tracking dots on them. You might need to resize them. You just want to get the whole marker in that little inner box right there. Okay, so now that you have all those selected again, we're just going to hit A again, and now we can hold Control and T to track them forward. Okay, so before we solve now, we need to clean it up a bit. We can see if we scrub throughout the clip, you should notice that kind of dots that go behind his head kind of shrink a little bit. So if I can find a pretty good one here, you'll notice right here it kind of shrinks. And so what we need to do is come to the point where it starts to shrink, so right around here. And then depending on which way it goes, so if I actually come out, you can see that basically forward is when it starts to lose its shape and everything. So what we need to do is have the markers selected and then come down here and hit this little clear track path. Now if the tracking marker was going in reverse, you do need to hit this one instead, and that will clear it backwards. You can just tell by, again, just scrubbing out through your clip and seeing which way it is actually shrinking. So I have a couple others that do that. I'm just going to show you real fast. So this one looks like it shrinks around here. So what we can do is just come here, and then it's forward, so we need to hit this button, and that has successfully erased the tracking beyond that point. Okay, so I'm just going to do that to all of mine that I kind of noticed, and you want to do that to yours as well, and then next we'll be ready to solve our camera motion. Okay guys, so if I scrub throughout this clip, you should notice that none of the markers stick to his body anymore, and none of them shrink or anything. So that is looking how we want it to look. So now we are actually ready to solve our camera motion. So let's come over to the Solve tab, hit Keyframe so it can determine the A and B keyframe. Then we're going to refine all of these and solve our camera motion. Okay, you can see that we got a solve error of a 0.71, so that's pretty good. However, it can be lower. So I'm just going to come over here, hit this Cleanup, Clean Tracks. We can open up this menu down here. And we just want to select a few, so I'm going to say 3 down here. That's pretty good. We're just going to delete those tracks. And then if we uncheck this keyframe button, now we can just solve the camera motion again. And you can see that that's already gotten our solve error down to a 0.59. I'm going to continue to clean my tracks. So just to show you one more time, we're going to come to Clean Tracks, push that reprojection error up a bit until we get like 2 or 3. Then just delete those and solve our camera motion again. Okay guys, so I cleaned my tracks a couple more times and was able to get my solve error down to a 0.3. Now if I was actually trying to do this for real, I would of course try to get that as low as possible. But since this is just for a tutorial, we're just going to leave it like this. So now we're actually ready to set up a tracking scene. So let's go ahead and come down here, set up a tracking scene. Now the floor isn't on our floor plane, as you can see. So we actually need to set that. Now what's weird about our floor plane is that we don't really have that many points on our floor. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to the end of the clip. So 180 for me. And then I'm just going to add another tracking marker here. And then instead of tracking it throughout the whole clip, I'm just going to track it 5 frames. So just hit this button 5 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like that. And now if we go ahead and solve the camera motion one last time, you should see that your solve error hasn't really changed. However, you can now have this point in our scene. So now we can select 3 of these points that form a 90-degree triangle on our floor. And then we can go up to set our orientation floor to be there. And then set this to be our origin, this to be our y-axis. And then these 2 points right here, we're just going to set the scale and up that a bit until it looks good. Okay, so now playing this, you can see that the floor is looking like it's staying on the floor of our actual character and our scene and everything. So that is looking pretty good. If yours doesn't look like that, you may need to mess around with your tracking markers and get a better track. Okay, so now let's go into the Layout tab. I'm just going to go ahead and delete all these stuff that it automatically set up. So both of these, the light that it set up, and then the background collection, and also the background view layer, we don't really need. And since we deleted both of those backgrounds, we can go ahead and delete all 4 of these nodes. We don't really need those. And then plug the movie clip into our alpha over and hit convert to pre-multiply, just so we have all of our compositing set up. Okay, so now we're actually ready to start making our scene. So let's come out to the Layout tab, and then down here we're going to go ahead and change it to cycles, device to GPU compute. I'm going to change my sample count down to a 32. We can change that a little bit later if we need to. Adaptive sampling on, viewport denoising on. Light paths, I'm going to change all these down to 3. We can of course come back and change these if we need to. For this scene, I'm going to turn both the reflective and refractive caustics off, since we're not really messing around with anything like that. And then finally, we need to make sure that film transparent is turned on, and in the performance tab, since I'm rendering on a GPU, we can just set the tile size to be a 512 by 512. The final thing that we need to do is come back down here, and now that we're done messing around with our footage, we can actually come and change the color management back to filmic instead of standard. Okay, so now we actually need to model out our scene. So let's come up here. I like to see where my tracking dots are in a scene. So let's come up here, go to motion tracking, and now we have our actual dots in our scene. Now if I actually go ahead and add a little floor plane, you will see that the rotation and everything is off. If I just wanted it to be flat, I would have to, you know, mess around with a bunch of stuff. So what I'm going to do is select the camera, then I'm just going to rotate that on the Z, so RZ. I'm just going to put that over until this little edge is kind of straight with our character and where he's looking. Okay, so one thing I want to do before we get started with modeling and everything is define where our character is sitting in our scene. So I'm just going to hide this by hitting H. Now you will see that these are on the floor, so that gives us a nice little reference to our floor. If we go into the side view by hitting 1, you should see that it's basically on the floor of our grid, of our 3D viewport and everything. So what we can do is I'm just going to go ahead and add in some empties. So Shift A, add, we're going to come down to empty. I'm just going to use the plane axis empty, just like that. So now I basically want to determine where his foot is and then where his knee is, because that's the general way he is facing and kind of his body length and everything, just to give us a rough idea of where he is going to be at. So since this is on the floor, we can just kind of hit G, Shift Z to move on every axis but the Z axis, and we're just going to put that right at the edge of his toe, like that. And now we also need to define where his knee is also. So I'm just going to hit Shift D to duplicate. Then we're going to hit Shift Z to move on every axis but the Z axis. Kind of just move it where his knee is right there. So now we know that our character in this 3D space is basically going to be sitting right here. With that now out of the way, I can go ahead and turn this off, the motion tracking, just so we have some freed up clutter in our viewport. We just needed that to determine where his feet are going to be. Okay, so now let's get to modeling. First of all, we need to Alt-H to unhide that plane. So this plane, I'm just going to hit SY to scale in the Y-axis, just so we have some more space to work with. Now, I basically just want a mountain in the distance with some fog and then kind of a rocky surface that he's sitting on. So let's go ahead and do some shading for the rocky surface. So I'm going to come up to the Shading tab. First of all, we need to set up the lighting for the scene, because if we render it out now, we won't be able to see what we're working with. So let's come up to the world. I'm going to add in an environment texture right here, and link is down below to the HDRI I am using. So just open up that HDRI, and we are now done with the lighting settings. We might have to come back later, but for now that is good. Let's go to the object settings, and then now we need to actually mess around with the shading for our objects. So I'm just going to create a new material. I'm going to name this material rock, just so we can organize that a little bit better. Now for this next part, you will need the Node Wrangler add-on that comes free with Blender. So let's come up to Edit, Preferences, then Add-ons, and then if you type in Node, you should see that this little option comes up, Node Wrangler. You just want to enable that. So now with that enabled, we can come down here, make sure that our principled BSDF is selected. Then if we hold Shift, Control, and T, that'll open up this menu. And so this menu is basically a principled texture setup. So Blender will take a set of textures and automatically link it up to the principled BSDF. It's just kind of a fast way that you can do that inside of Blender with the Node Wrangler add-on. So the link to the materials that I'm going to be using are in the description below. So you just want to extract that material into its own folder. So I have my Mossy Rock folder right here, and you should see all that we have all these PNG images. Now I did download the 4K version. If you have a higher end computer, I recommend the 8K PNG version just because it's higher fidelity. But we can just hit A to select all these and hit principled texture setup, and that should make this whole mess of nodes down here automatically set up with one click of a button. Okay, so now you will notice that our texture is on our plane. However, it's looking kind of distorted and everything. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to the top view by hitting 7. Then I'm going to go into edit mode by hitting tab, hit A to select everything, and then U to unwrap. And for this one, we're going to project from view. Just so it's a nice and even kind of coat right here. You can always come up to the UV editing tab if you wanted more control over it. However, this is what I'm going to stick with. Okay, so now that we have that, we actually need to mess around with the scale because the scale is a little too big right now. So I'm just going to add in a value node and plug that into the scale of our mapping little group over here. Then let's just play around with that a bit. I'm just going to continue to go up until I get a scale that I'm kind of happy with. Something like that I think is going to look pretty good. We can always mess around with that later, but that's what I'm going to stick with right now. Now let's actually go into the rendered view just to see what we're working with. Okay, you can see that our texture is on like that. However, it's not really looking too realistic or anything. That's actually because we don't have that much geometry in our scene, and it's not really displacing that plane. It's really just putting that image texture on the plane. So what we need to do is actually create this And so what we actually need to do is create some displacement. So first of all, I'm going to come to the material properties down here to the settings. Right here you can see that we have this displacement, and right now it's set to be bump only, which basically means that's just going to be a 2D kind of faking of displacement. However, we want it to be from bump only to displacement only. And you can see that that's basically just shifted it down. However, that's only because we don't have that much geometry in the scene. We only have 4 vertices, so it's basically just pushing the whole plane down. So what we need to do is add a subdivision surface modifier, like that. Now you still might notice that it hasn't done much. You might notice a little curve right there, but we actually need to enable a experimental feature for this little render. This experimental feature is going to give us a lot more detail and a lot more controllability of how our actual rocks look. So let's come up here we're going to change the feature set from supported to experimental. And now if we come back to the modifier section, we will notice this adaptive subdivision. So let's turn that on and just see what that's done. And you can see that that's done a lot more detail in our scene, and that is looking a lot better. Now let's just go ahead and render this out to see how this is looking. Okay, so you can see that that's given us a lot of detail in this little rock texture. Let's come out of here and go ahead and mess around with our mountains in the background. So I'm just going to quickly add another mesh landscape. Now if you don't have that option for any reason, come up to edit preferences, and then in the add-on section we're just going to type in landscape, and it's this landscape add-on. I highly recommend you guys enable that. So again, just mesh landscape down here, and then you can change around some of the settings in here, but for this tutorial we're just going to leave it on the default settings. So let's just bring that kind of in the background wherever we want it and come out. I'm just going to make it huge, trying to make it to scale as much as possible. If you notice it disappearing, that's actually because we have our clip set to something very low, so it's clipping out of our view distance. So let's just set that up to something crazy, and while we're at it, let's go ahead and set the camera clipping to be some massive number too. It doesn't really matter as long as it gets everything in frame. So now we can just move this kind of off in the distance where that's not gonna really be seen that much. We might need to scale it down, scale it up, just make it look nice and how it would actually be in real life. I do recommend that you go throughout your footage and make sure that it's being hit by every single angle, such as this. I might need to make it a bit larger, and so now that is getting both of the sides and also the main view, so just a little cautionary note. Okay, so now if we go into render view, we will notice that there is no texture on our mountain yet. That's just because it gives it a default texture like this, the white. So let's go ahead and change that, go to shading, and we're going to give this a little nice little node treatment to make it look like mountains. So I'm just going to make a new material, name that mountains, or mountain, like that. So this, I'm basically gonna need 2 principled BSDFs, one to act as our snow and then one to act as our rock. So I'm gonna go ahead and select this principled BSDF, Shift D. Now we have 2 of them. Now we need to combine them, so let's just go ahead and hit a mix shader node and then just plug both of those into those sockets on the mix shader. Next, let's plug the shader into the surface of our material output. And now let's give the top one a nice little gray color, just to kind of show you what this mix shader is doing. You can basically see that's lightened it. And all this is doing is mixing the 2 colors right now. So this is the first color, and then this is the second color. And by default, the factor is set to 0.5, so it's basically mixing those 2 colors to be its own color. We don't want this, however. We kind of want some patches and everything to act as our snow patches on the mountain. So what we need to do is add in a Musgrave texture. I find that Musgrave works the best for this, but there are many things that you can do to get a similar result. We're going to plug the height into the factor. Then you can hold Shift, Control, and click to view what that's looking like. Now I'm just going to increase the scale, let's say like that. I actually am going to hit Control T to add a mapping and texture coordinate node. And we can just set the Z scale to be 0, just so it's only affected in the X and Y, like that. And then let's mess around with the dimension. That'll give us a little more detail, and just pump that up like that. That's looking pretty good. Let's mess around with the scale just because that's a little too much right now. Something like that. Just play around with it until you get something that you like. but this is probably what I'm going to stick with. Okay, so now let's plug the shader back into the surface just to see what we're dealing with. Okay, so now you will see we have this result. However, we need to mess around with some of the materials. So let's come up to this material specifically and make this a nice little dark gray color. Then I'm going to add in another Musgrave just to add some kind of detail to this little rock surface. So I'm just going to plug that into the normal and then add a bump node in between there. Just plug that into the height just so we have a little bit of noise. So that's a little too large. Let's scale that a lot down, something like that. Let's make the detail like that. Just play around with it, just trying to get a lot of dots in the scene. And so now that's looking like that, and we can see that we now have this result for just the rocks. And if we plug that into the mix shader, for some reason it's kind of bugging out on me. You can't really see the rock texture, so I'm going to go ahead and hop over to render view. That should fix it. Okay, so that seems to fix it. So if you have that issue, make sure to do that. I'm just going to darken these rocks a little bit since they're a little too light right now. Then I noticed that it's a little bit shiny for some reason. Let's turn the roughness up, specular down, something like that. That is looking alright. You can, of course, if you don't like the snow patterns, you can of course change some of this. So I might change it, something like that. That looks a bit better. So that is the mountain now complete. Okay, so now let's go ahead and render out an image to see what we're working with. Okay, so this is all looking okay. However, there's one major step that we need to do that will really bring this into photorealism. And that, of course, is to add fog into our scene. Fog will make it look super realistic and so much better than this little flat image that we have right now. So let's come out of this. Now, volumetrics inside Blender are very annoying since they take forever to render and you can never get them to look exactly how you want it. So what I'm going to do just for this scene is going to do a mispass and kind of fake a bit of volumetrics. So come to the view layer properties right here. Then come down, we're going to enable this mispass. And now if we come to the world, we should now see this little box, the mispass section. Now you will notice it's not really doing anything to our scene. So in order to actually see that, we need to be on the render view. And then if we come down here, we can hit the render pass to be, instead of combined, which it's on default, we can set it to be mist. And now we have this little mist section. So now what we can do is come over to this mispass section again that's in the world properties. We're just going to move this depth up until we can barely see the mountains in the distance. Okay, so depending on how much fog you want in your scene, you can of course change it to whatever you want, but I'm just going to keep increasing it up until I get the desired effect that I'm really looking for. So that is looking pretty good right there. I'm just going to call it that is good. So I'm going to come back out into here and change the pass to be combined again. So again, that won't do anything with our scene. We actually have to composite that in. So let's go ahead and do that by going to the compositing tab. And then just in this render layers node, you should see that we have this little mist section right here. So what we're going to do to simply add mist into our scene, we're going to make a mix node. It's super simple. We're going to add our image into the top socket and then the mist into the factor. And now if we kind of view what that looks like, you will notice that it hasn't actually done anything, and that's because we need to render out another image. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so coming back into the compositing section, you can see it in the background. That is looking really good now, and it really blends in everything and makes it look like it's actually there. We also now have the sky color, so that's pretty nice, just a little bonus that we have in our scene. So that's pretty much everything. The only thing that we have left to do is to actually have our shadow of our person on the ground. So let's come out to the layout tab, and this is where those little things that we place on the floor come in handy. So we're just going to come right here. I'm just going to go ahead and hide both the mountain and our floor. Can go into solid view. Now what we need to do is go ahead and add a plane. It can just be a regular plane, and we're just going to rotate that. You can come up to the top view. We basically need to rotate this plane so that it's touching both of the middle of our little tracking things that we placed earlier. Remember, this is where his feet were, so just a little cautionary thing right there. So let's just bring this up, and now we can go into wireframe, just so we can actually see the outline of our guy. And now if we go into edit mode by hitting tab and then hit K to go into knife select, we can basically just start clicking around our character, and now we can actually cut his shape out. Now you don't have to be too precise with this, since this is only going to be kind of like a shadow catcher. So we can just kind of be a little bit rough with this. We're also going to add a subdivision surface modifier to it. So once you have them all cut out, we can hit enter like that. Go back into solid view, and then we're just going to select the two edges that it didn't cut out like that. Delete the faces, and now we have a perfect character that is going to be our shadow catcher. Okay, now to actually add it to be 3D, because right now it's a little 2D plane, we're going to go ahead and go back into edit mode. Then with its face selected, we're just going to hit E to extrude it one way, then select the face again and extrude it the other way. And then with both of these sides selected, we can actually just scale those down a bit, just so it's a little kind of like body shape. Now we can go to the modifiers tab. We're just going to add in a subdivision surface modifier, and then that is good. We don't need to really mess around with that too much. So now we have our character in our scene. I'm actually going to move him a little bit over here, since that is where he would be in the actual scene. Okay, so now if we render this out, we could actually see this blob. So we need to go ahead and add a new collection. I'm just going to name this collection Shadow, and then place our little character inside of that. And now the shadow collection is going to be set to be view layer indirect only. That basically just means that anything in that collection is only going to cast shadows or do anything that indirectly affects other objects. So now let's come to render, hit Alt H to unhide everything. And now we can see that we have this little shadow in our scene. I don't like that the shadow is going off that direction, so I'm going to come up to the shading tab, come back into the world. Then if I have this selected, we can hold Control and T and then rotate the Z-axis until we get it to a location that we are happy with. So maybe just a little bit more, something like that. That looks pretty good. Then one final thing while we're in here is I do notice that it's a little bit white light. However, I think it would look better in warmer light. So we're just going to quickly add in some warm light. So I'm just going to add in a mix RGB node, place this color into the first color. And then I'm just going to let's try this orange color in it. Then you can mess around with the factor. We do need to plug the color into the background so that affects our object. So that is looking pretty good. We can see that that's now affected our color of our HDRI and improved the lighting in our scene. So now let's render out one more image to see if everything is looking good. Okay, so let's go into the compositing tab and see how that looks. We can see that we have the fog in the background and then our shadow on these rocks. So that is pretty much it for this background. Now, I won't be doing the compositing inside of Blender, but if you want to see me actually composite inside of Blender some green screen footage, I recommend watching my other tutorial. Link to that is in the description. Okay, so since we're not compositing inside of Blender, I'm just going to delete both of these nodes since we don't really need that, and plug this mix into our composite. Now, one thing I will do is to add a denoise node, just because our render is going to be very noisy if we don't, since we are rendering on a low sample count. And speaking of sample count, I'm going to render at a 64 sample count. And I'm also, while we're at it, I'm going to change the resolution down to a 1920 by 1080p video, just because that will save us a lot of render time, since that's going to be the final output. And so now let's just come down here, add a denoising data. That should add a lot more options here. We're just going to add in denoise right here. Now, since I'm going to be using Cycles X to actually render this out, it doesn't have this option for noisy image yet. It might come soon, or it might already be there. I haven't really checked. So instead, we're going to plug the image into this image, then the normal into the normal, and the albedo to the albedo. And then we can just replace that image with this render layers node, and that let's just take this image out just so this bottom one is white again. And now that has actually denoised our image, so that is all set up. And now finally we need to do some output properties. So again, we're going to come down here, specify a new folder. You can name it whatever you want. I'm just going to name mine GS background for green screen background. Just hit accept. Then for the file format, we're just going to come down here. We're going to render it out as a video. So FFmpeg video, encoding MP4, then output quality high, like that. And now finally we are ready to render our background animation. So let's go ahead and render out that animation. Okay guys, so that has just finished rendering. Let's take a look at it. We can see that it's tracked nicely, and we also have everything kind of moving in the background how you expect in our shot. Now this is actually from a previous tutorial. I didn't want to re-render it all out, but I basically follow the same steps I showed you earlier. Now let's go ahead and composite it with our footage and get a good result. So I'm going to be using After Effects today. Again, if you want to see the Blender version, linked is in the description to that tutorial. But let's come down here and go to After Effects. Okay, so once inside After Effects, we just need to drop all of our footage in. So we have the background right here, and then also the green screen footage. So we're just going to both drop those both in the project over here. And for this, I'm just going to go ahead and put this background to be our new composition. And then let's just drop that green screen footage right on top of that. Now they are at different sizes. The green screen is a 4K, whereas the other one is not. So I'm just going to come down here. Let's transform the scale to a 50% just so that those both match up. Now I believe both of the clips should match up, and we shouldn't have to mess around with the timing of anything. You can see that both the frame rates are correct, so that is all looking good. First things first, we need to key the background, get rid of the green. So I'm just going to come over here, select that, go to Effect, Keying, Key Light 1.2, select our screen color. I'm just going to select one of the greens around his hair like that. And then let's just go into the screen matte, go into screen matte over here, and then let's just bump those around to get a nice little key. Again, you don't want to go too crazy with these numbers, so that is looking pretty good. Scale back just a tiny bit just because I don't like how far that is going. Okay, so something like that, that looks pretty good. Let's go to the final result. So there, that is looking good. Let's come over here to do another key light. This will basically remove all of these little markers right here. So keying, key light 1.2. Then instead of the green, we're just going to select one of these blue colors down here, like that. Let's mess around with the screen matte again. So select both those to be our screen matte. I'm just going to basically just try to isolate just the markers, like that. Bring that up a bit. Okay, something like that is looking good. Now let's come back out, go to the final result. Okay, so I accidentally messed up there. Let's just kind of do it outside of it. His shirt is blue, so that was my bad for filming with a blue shirt. We should have noticed that a little bit sooner. Okay, there we go. We finally isolated the blues of our tracking markers. So these are the things I did for mine. You might need to do something different for yours. However, we lost the blue in his shirt and everything. So what I found works for me is the replace method. We're going to replace that from soft color to source. And that actually brings the blue back and everything. Don't know how that works, but it does, so we're going to use it. Okay, so finally, just some little things that can make this a little bit better is we're going to try to match the lighting of our scene. So I'm going to go ahead and add in a color correction. Let's do levels down here. I'm just going to mess around with some of the gamma like that. I'm going to set this to be red and this to be red. Just some basic coloring right here. Now there are many tutorials out there for color correction, so I won't really be talking about that much, but this is the method I use for now since I don't really know any other method and haven't really tested too much with that. So how is that looking? Let's see how that's looking. That's looking a little bit better. Let's add a little bit of green, and that should be pretty good. Just a tiny bit, maybe a tiny bit of red too. Once you do it for a while, you also know kind of what you have to add and stuff. So here is before, and then here's after. Kind of just blends it in the scene a little better. Now we just need to add some noise to our background since it's a little too clean. So let's come to the background. I'm going to add a effect noise right here. And then the noise amount, I usually stick to somewhere below 5%. I'm just going to stick it to 3 for now. Might need to change it later. Now you will see that my markers are still appearing, so I highly recommend you just mess around with your keying to try to get those out as much as possible. Next though, we can actually go ahead and add a little bit of a garbage matte around him just to kind of eliminate the top right here. You can see that we have the top of our thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a quick mask with the pen tool, and then if we go into the mask settings right here, we can animate this path. So let's just come back up here. And I'm basically just going to animate it throughout the clip, just trying to make him be always seen and surrounded by this little mask. Just bring that out there. Now I want to try to do this as little as possible just to save on some keystrokes. So I'm just gonna in between it. So I'm basically just having it. So these 2 points right here, I'm basically gonna come in the middle right here, make sure it's good. Maybe expand it just a little bit so we have some wiggle room. And then I'll come to these 2 points in the middle, make sure it's good. And then so on and so on until it perfectly covers his body throughout the clip. Okay, so we can now see that the mask basically follows our character throughout, kind of just staying as close to him as possible. So that is looking good. And that's pretty much it. That's all the stuff I did for this shot. Let's go ahead and render this out, and we can see our final result. Okay, so File, Export. I highly recommend you guys just use Adobe Media Encoder if you have it. If not, you can just use After Effects to render it out. I'm just going to show you how I rendered it out. Okay, so in Media Encoder, we have our project brought up right here. Now I use the H.264 layout. That's a MP4 file. Now if you wanted to use a MOV file or a AVI, whatever you want to use, I highly recommend you just use that. But for me, MP4 just works the best. So again, H.264. Match sort, high bit rate. You can set the output name and location, so I'm just going to go ahead and set that. Okay, once that is set, you can mess around with as many of these settings as you want. For me, I'm just going to leave it at the default values, but if you wanted to use the maximum render quality or anything like that, make sure to go set that. We're just going to hit OK. And then when we are ready, we're just going to hit this little icon up here, and that should render out our final composition. Okay guys, on the screen right now is the final result for this tutorial. I had a lot of fun making this, and hopefully you guys learned a lot from this tutorial. Now we have a Patreon and Discord. Links to those are in the description below, but thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys later. Peace.